breakdown or hallucination brought on by too many years of long hauls and too little sleep. But when he looked over at Sarah again, she was barely there at all. Just an outline, a suggestion of a person fading away like smoke. "Take the Elvis Presley Boulevard exit," she instructed, her voice now seeming to come from very far away. "You know the way." And somehow he did know the way. His hands moved the steering wheel automatically, following a route that felt familiar, even though he could not remember ever taking it before. Streets of Memphis passed by in a blur until he found himself pulling up in front of the famous gates of Grakeland. Even at nearly 400 in the morning, there were flowers and tributes left by fans who had traveled from around the world to pay their respects. When Marcus looked over at the passenger seat, it was empty. Sarah was gone, vanished as completely as if she had never been there at all. But on the seat where she had been sitting, there was a wet spot, as if someone had been crying, and pinned to the seat back was a faded photograph of a young woman in a white dress standing beside a car from the 1970s. The photograph was water-damaged and yellowing with age, but the face was unmistakably Sarah's. Marcus sat in his cab for nearly an hour staring at that photograph and trying to make sense of what had happened. When the sun finally began to rise over Memphis, he carefully unpinned the picture and placed it in his logbook. Then he drove to the nearest truck stop and tried to put the whole experience out of his mind. Could not forget. Over the next few weeks, he found himself researching traffic fatalities from August 1977. Looking for any mention of a young woman named Sarah Mills. What he found made his blood run cold. There had indeed been a fatal accident on Interstate 40 in Arkansas. On the night Elvis Presley died, a 22-year-old woman from Little Rock had been killed when her car was struck by a tractor-trailer during heavy fog. The woman's name was Sarah Mills, and she had been on her way to Memphis to leave flowers at Graceland. Marcus never drove Interstate 40 through Arkansas again. He took longer routes, added hundreds of unnecessary miles to his trips, anything to avoid that stretch of highway. But sometimes on foggy nights when he was driving through other parts of the country, he would catch glimpses of her in his peripheral vision, a woman in white standing on the shoulder of the road with her thumb out, waiting patiently for the next driver who might help her finish her final journey. And he knew that somewhere out there on nights when the fog rolls in just right, Sarah Mills is still trying to get to Graceland. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a moonscape of sand and scrub brush broken only by the occasional Joshua tree reaching toward the star-filled sky. Rebecca Martinez had been driving for 14 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Denver, and her body was screaming for a break. The digital clock on her dashboard read 11:43 p.m. when she finally saw the blue sign indicating a rest area ahead. Rebecca, or Becca, as she was known on the CB radio, was one of the few female long-haul truckers working the western routes. At 34, she had been driving for 8 years, ever since her divorce had left her needing a fresh start and a way to support her 2 kids back in Sacramento. She was tough as nails and had learned early on that showing any sign of weakness on the road could be dangerous for a woman traveling alone. The rest stop appeared out of the darkness like an oasis, its parking lot illuminated, harsh fluorescent lights that created stark pools of white against the black desert night. It was one of those basic facilities you find scattered along remote stretches of interstate, nothing more than restrooms, vending machines, and a few picnic tables surrounded by a small patch of struggling grass. Most importantly for Becca, it had designated truck parking away from the main car lot. As she pulled her 18-wheeler into the truck section, she noticed she was not alone. 2 other big rigs were already parked there, their drivers presumably sleeping in their cabs. But something felt off about the scene. The trucks were positioned strangely, not in the neat parallel lines that experienced drivers typically favored, but angled in ways that seemed almost random. And despite the late hour, she could see lights spilling from the windows of both cabs, suggesting the drivers were still awake. Becca set her air brakes and shut down the engine, the sudden silence feeling oppressive after hours of noise. She had planned to just use the restroom and grab a quick snack from the vending machines before catching a few hours of sleep. But now she found herself hesitating. Something about this place felt wrong, though she could not put her finger on what exactly was bothering her. She grabbed her purse and a small flashlight from the glove compartment, then climbed down from the cab. The desert air was surprisingly cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the day, and she pulled her denim jacket tighter around her shoulders. As she walked toward the restroom building, she noticed that the parking lot was not as empty as it had first appeared. Several cars were scattered throughout the civilian parking area, their occupants presumably sleeping inside or using the facilities. The women's restroom was typical of these roadside stops, functional but grim with flickering fluorescent lights and the perpetual smell of industrial disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying odors. Becca did her business quickly, eager to get back to the relative safety of her truck. But as she was washing her hands at the cracked porcelain sink, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Heavy footsteps, the kind made by boots or work shoes, not the lighter tread of someone wearing sneakers or dress shoes. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if the person was trying to be quiet, but not quite succeeding. Becca froze, listening intently. The footsteps stopped right outside the women's restroom door. She waited, barely breathing, for what felt like several minutes. Finally, the footsteps moved away, but instead of the sound fading as the person walked toward the parking lot, they seemed to circle around the building. Becca realized with growing alarm that whoever was out there was moving around the perimeter of the restroom facility, as if looking for another way in, or simply trying to get a better look at who was inside. Apparently studying the selections, but his attention was not on the candy bars and sodas. He was watching the restroom doors and the reflection of the machine's glass front. Becca's heart rate spiked. Every instinct she had developed during her years on the road was telling her to get back to her truck as quickly as possible. She had heard too many stories about women who had disappeared from rest stops, about predators who specifically targeted female truckers because they knew those women would be traveling alone and far from help. She tried to walk casually toward the exit, but the man at the vending machines turned to face her directly. He was younger than she had expected, maybe in his 30s, with a scraggly beard and eyes that seemed to glitter with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He smiled at her. She noticed that several of his teeth were missing. "Evening," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Pretty late to be out here all alone, do not you think?" "Just passing through," Becca replied, not slowing her pace toward the door. "Have a good night." But as she reached for the exit, the man moved to block her path. He was not being overtly threatening, just standing in a way that made it impossible for her to leave without pushing past him. "No need to rush off," he said. "Why do not we chat for a bit? It gets lonely out here in the desert." Becca felt panic rising in her chest. Through the glass doors, she could see her truck parked in the lot, but it suddenly seemed very far away. "I really need to get going," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "My dispatcher is expecting me to check in soon." The man's smile widened, showing more missing teeth. "Oh, I do not think anyone is expecting to hear from you for a while. These desert stretches service gets real spotty. Sometimes people just disappear for days at a time." That was when Becca noticed the other men. They had emerged from the cars parked in the civilian lot, and were now standing in the parking area between her and her truck. 3 of them all wearing similar clothing and all watching the restroom building with obvious intent. This was not a random encounter. These men had been waiting for someone like her to stop. Becca's mind raced. She was outnumbered 4-1, far from any help with no service and no way to call for assistance. But she was not going to go down without a fight. Years of dealing with aggressive men at truck stops and loading docks had taught her that sometimes the only way to handle a threat was to meet it head on. "You boys picked the wrong woman to mess with," she said, her voice suddenly hard as steel. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small canister of pepper spray, holding it where they could all see it. "Now get out of my way." The man blocking the door laughed. "That little thing is not going to help you much against 4 of us, honey. Why do not you just make this easy on yourself?" But Becca was already moving. Instead of trying to push past him toward the main exit, she spun around and ran deeper into the building, heading for the family restroom at the far end of the corridor. It was a desperate move, but she remembered seeing a small window in that room when she had used these facilities on previous trips. If she could get inside and lock the door, maybe she could squeeze through the window and circle around to her truck. She heard shouts behind her as the men realized what she was doing. Heavy footsteps pounded on the tile floor as they gave chase. But Becca reached the family restroom first and slammed the door behind her, turning the deadbolt just as someone crashed against the other side. The pounding on the door was immediately followed by threats and obscenities. "You're just making this harder on yourself," one of them yelled. "You cannot stay in there forever." Becca ignored them and focused on the window. It was higher and smaller than she had remembered, but it was her only chance. She climbed onto the sink and started working at the latch, her hands shaking with adrenaline. Behind her, the pounding on the door grew more violent, and she could hear the sound of the frame beginning to splinter. The window finally opened with a screech of protest, and Becca squeezed through head first, scraping her arms and legs on the metal frame. She dropped onto the gravel outside just as she heard the restroom door finally give way behind her. Now she was outside the building, but still not safe. The men would be pouring out of the restroom any second, and she was still a 100-yard from her truck across an open parking lot. But as she started to run, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the distinctive growl of a diesel engine starting up. One of the other trucks in the lot was coming to life, its headlights cut through the dark. The driver had apparently heard the commotion and was moving to investigate. As the big rig swung around toward the restroom building, Becca ran toward it, waving her arms and shouting. The truck stopped and the passenger door swung open. "Get in," shouted the driver, an older black man with gray hair and kind eyes. Becca did not hesitate. She scrambled up into the cab just as her pursuers came running around the corner of the building. "Those men were trying to attack me," she gasped, still breathing hard from her escape. "I figured as much," the driver replied, already reaching for his CB radio. "Name is Franklin Washington, and I have been driving these roads for 30 years. I know trouble when I see it." He keyed the microphone. "Breaker 119. This is Ghost Rider. Looking for any Smoky Bears in the area. We got a situation at mile marker 2047 on eastbound I-80. Need immediate assistance." The response was immediate. A Nevada state trooper happened to be only 10 miles away and arrived within minutes, or his flashing lights turning the rest stop into a kaleidoscope of red and blue. By then, 3 of the 4 attackers had fled into the desert, but one was caught trying to hide in his car. Later, Becca learned that the group had been operating along this stretch of highway for months, targeting lone travelers and especially women. Several people had been reported missing in the area, and the authorities suspected these men were responsible for much more than attempted assault. As dawn broke over the Nevada desert, Becca sat in her truck, filling out police reports and trying to process what had happened. Franklin Washington had stayed with her through the entire ordeal, refusing to leave until he was certain she was safe. "You did good back there," he told her as the sun painted the desert sky pink and gold. "Kept your head, trusted your instinct. That is what saved you." Becca nodded, still shaken, but grateful to be alive. She had always known that life on the road carried risks, especially for women traveling alone, but she had never Imagined how quickly a routine rest stop could turn into a nightmare. From that night forward, she never stopped at isolated rest areas alone again, and she made sure every female trucker she met knew about the dangers that could be waiting in the darkness of America's loneliest highways. The static crackled through the CB radio like electricity dancing across dry skin. William Big Bill O'Connor had been listening to the chatter for the past hour as he pushed his Peterbilt through the Montana wilderness. But what he was hearing tonight was different from the usual trucker talk. The voices seemed older somehow, using slang and terminology he had not heard since his grandfather's generation of drivers. Bill was a third-generation trucker from Flint, Michigan, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and a gray beard that reached halfway down his chest. At 52, he had been hauling freight for over 30 years, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. He knew every major highway in the continental United States like other people knew their own neighborhood, and he prided himself on never getting lost, no matter how bad the weather got. But tonight was testing even his legendary sense of direction. A late November blizzard had blown in from Canada with a vengeance, turning Interstate 94 into a white nightmare of swirling snow and zero visibility. The temperature had dropped to 15 below, and the wind was howling like a pack of wolves across the prairie. Bill's load of automotive parts, bound for Seattle, was already a day behind schedule, but he was determined to make up time once the storm passed. The CB crackled again. Bill frowned and checked his GPS. He was approaching mile marker 27-5, but there was no place called Devil's Canyon anywhere along this route. He had driven this stretch of I-94 hundreds of times, and he knew every landmark, every truck stop, every steep grade between Billings and Missoula. Devil's Canyon was not on any map he had ever seen, but the offer of a convoy was tempting. Driving alone through this kind of weather was dangerous, and there was safety in numbers. If one truck broke down or slid off the road, the others could provide assistance. Bill keyed his microphone. "This is Diesel Bearer running westbound at mile marker 2 and join that convoy if you got room for one more." The response came immediately. "Welcome to the party, Diesel Bear. We got 7 rigs already and room for more. Just follow the leader when you see our taillights." Moondog out. Through the swirling snow, Bill began to make out red taillights ahead of him. Not just 1 or 2 sets, but a long line of them stretching into the white void. As he drew closer, he could see the outline of the convoy. Massive trucks with high exhaust stacks and chrome bumpers that gleamed even in dim light. These were not modern rigs like his own Peterbilt. They looked like something from the 1970s or early the 1980s, the golden age of trucking when drivers were kings of the highway and regulations were few. Bill fell in line behind the last truck, a beautiful Kenworth conventional with enough chrome to blind a man on a sunny day. The driver's CB handle was apparently Road Warrior, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had been running these highways since before Bill was born. "Stay tight, Diesel Bear," Road Warrior advised. "This stretch gets tricky when the wind picks up. We lost a driver here about 10 years back when he tried to go it alone." The convoy moved as one organism through the storm, each truck maintaining perfect spacing despite the terrible visibility. Emergency medical runs were not uncommon in his line of work, and the extra money would help pay for his daughter's college tuition. He finished his coffee, climbed back into his Freightliner, and headed north toward Detroit through the winter night. The pickup location was not what he expected. Instead of a modern pharmaceutical facility, Jamal found himself at an industrial complex on the outskirts of Detroit that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Crumbling concrete buildings stretched across several acres, their broken windows staring out like dead eyes. One building showed signs of activity with bright security lights, illuminating a loading dock where several men in white lab coats were waiting beside a refrigerated trailer. A thin man with wire-rimmed glasses approached Jamal's cab. As he backed up to the dock, he introduced himself as Doc Morrison and explained that they were running behind schedule due to equipment problems. The cargo was extremely sensitive, he stressed, and any temperature fluctuation could render it worthless. "What exactly am I hauling?" Jamal asked, as he watched the men load sealed containers into his refrigerated trailer. Each container was about the size of a large cooler, and marked with biohazard symbols and warnings in multiple languages. Dr. Morrison's smile looked forced. "Organ preservation solutions and specialized blood products. Very expensive, very delicate. The less you know, the better for everyone involved." Jamal had hauled medical supplies before, so the explanation seemed reasonable enough. But something about the whole setup felt off. The men loading his trailer worked with nervous efficiency, constantly checking their watches and glancing over their shoulders as if they expected someone to interrupt them at any moment. And the containers themselves were heavier than any medical supplies Jamal had ever transported, requiring 2 men each to lift them into the trailer. By 12:45 a.m., the loading was complete. Morrison handed Jamal a sealed envelope containing his delivery instructions and payment information, along with strict warnings about maintaining the temperature and avoiding any delays. As Jamal pulled away from the loading dock, he caught a glimpse of the men in lab coats, hurriedly dismantling their equipment and loading it into unmarked vans. The first few hours of the drive were uneventful. Jamal made good time through Indiana and Illinois, stopping only for fuel and mandatory rest breaks. The refrigeration unit hummed steadily, maintaining the required temperature, and his cargo seemed secure. But as he crossed into Missouri in the early morning hours, he began to hear sounds coming from the trailer. At first, he dismissed it as the normal creaking and settling that refrigerated trailers made as they expanded and contracted with temperature changes. But the sounds were different from anything he had experienced before. They were rhythmic, almost like breathing, and they seemed to come in waves that lasted several minutes at a time. Jamal turned up his radio to drown out the noise and focused on the road ahead. He had strict instructions not to open the trailer under any circumstance, and he intended to follow those instructions to the letter. But the sounds continued, growing more pronounced as the night wore on. By the time he reached Kansas, what had started as subtle creaking had evolved into something that sounded disturbingly organic. It was near Salina, Kansas, that Jamal first heard what sounded like scratching. Not the metallic scraping of loose cargo shifting around, but the soft, persistent scratching of fingernails against wood or plastic. The sound came from directly behind his cab, as if something was trying to claw its way through the wall that separated the trailer from the driver's compartment. Jamal pulled into a truck stop and walked around his rig, checking the trailer doors and examining the refrigeration unit. Everything appeared normal. The temperature gauge showed a steady 30. The doors were securely locked and there were no signs of damage or tampering. But when he pressed his ear against the side of the trailer, he could hear movement inside. Definite, deliberate movement that had nothing to do with shifting cargo. Medical supplies did not make the kinds of sounds he was hearing, and the secrecy surrounding the cargo was beginning to feel sinister rather than professional. As he continued west through Kansas, the sounds from the trailer intensified. What had started as occasional scratching evolved into a constant scrabbling noise, as if multiple somethings were trying to get out. And underneath it all, Jamal began to hear what sounded like muffled voices. Not clear enough to make out words, but definitely human voices speaking in urgent, frightened tones. By the time he reached the Colorado border, Jamal was sweating despite the February cold. The voices from the trailer had become more distinct, and he was certain he could hear people calling for help. Women's voices, young voices, pleading in what sounded like different languages. The scratching had intensified to the point where he could feel vibrations through his seat, as if whatever was in the trailer was literally trying to claw through the walls. Jamal pulled over at a remote rest area and sat in his cab, hands shaking as he stared at the sealed envelope Morrison had given him. Against every professional instinct, he tore it open and read the delivery instructions. What he found made his stomach turn. The cargo was not bound for a research facility in Phoenix. It was going to a private warehouse in the desert outside the city, with deliveries scheduled for the middle of the night, and specific instructions to ask no questions and leave immediately after unloading. The voices from the trailer were growing more desperate now, and Jamal could distinctly hear someone sobbing. These were not medical supplies he was hauling. These were people, living, breathing, terrified people who had been loaded into his refrigerated trailer like cargo. Jamal's hands trembled as he reached for his CB radio. Breaker 1, N. This is Peach State looking for any Smokey Bear in the area. I got an emergency situation and need immediate assistance. The response came quickly from a Colorado state trooper, who happened to be patrolling nearby. Within 20 minutes, the rest area was flooded with police cars, ambulances, and federal agents. When they finally cut the locks and opened Jamal's trailer, they found 11 young women and 3 teenage girls, all suffering from hypothermia and dehydration, but alive. The women were victims of human trafficking, kidnapped from various cities across the Midwest, and being transported to buyers on the West Coast. The refrigerated trailer had been chosen not to preserve medical supplies, but to muffle their voices and prevent them from being heard at weigh stations and inspection points. Dr. Morrison and his associates were part of a larger network that used legitimate trucking companies to transport their human cargo across state lines. Jamal spent the next 2 days giving statements to FBI agents and trying to process what he had unknowingly been part of. The trucking company that had hired him claimed they had been duped by fake documentation and professional references, but several of their drivers were arrested as accomplices. The pay rate that had seemed too good to be true turned out to be exactly that. The case made national headlines and led to the arrest of dozens of people involved in the trafficking network. But for Jamal, the victory felt hollow. He had come within hours of delivering 14 innocent people to a fate worse than death, and the knowledge that he had been used as an unwitting accomplice in such evil would haunt him for the rest of his life. He never drove long haul again. The sounds from that trailer, the desperate voices calling for help, the scratching of fingernails against metal walls, all of it followed him into his dreams and made it impossible to spend long hours alone, on the road. Instead, he took a job doing local deliveries around Savannah, where he could be home with his family every night. But sometimes when Jamal saw other trucks on the highway with their cargo hidden behind sealed doors, he wondered what secrets they might be carrying, and he made sure to report anything suspicious to the authorities, because he had learned that in a world where people could be treated like cargo, asking too few questions could be just as dangerous as asking too many. The 14 women and girls rescued the moment he left the interstate. But when he circled back around and rejoined the highway heading west, they reappeared within minutes, resuming their exact position behind him. Dakota's hands were shaking now, and not just from the caffeine. Whatever was following him was not bound by the normal rules of physics or geography. It existed only in his mirrors, maintaining its presence regardless of his speed or route changes, but disappearing whenever he left the main highway. The logical part of his mind insisted this was impossible, but the evidence was right there in his rear-view mirror. Hour after hour, as he crossed into Colorado, Dakota began to notice that other drivers were acting strangely around him. Cars would approach from behind, their headlights growing larger in his mirrors, but then they would suddenly swerve into the other lane and speed past him without apparent reason. Some drivers flashed their high beams at him repeatedly, as if trying to warn him of some danger he could not see. Dakota tried using his CB radio to ask what was wrong, but none of the other drivers would respond to his calls. It was as if they could see something following his truck that he himself could only perceive as lights in his mirror. The sun rose over the Colorado plains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, but daylight brought no relief from Dakota's supernatural pursuer. If anything, the phenomenon seemed to intensify during the day. In his mirrors, Dakota could now make out more details of the vehicle following him. It appeared to be a truck, similar to his own. Peterbilt, but older, and somehow wrong. The proportions were off, as if the truck had been stretched or distorted in ways that hurt to look at directly. And behind the windshield of the phantom truck, Dakota could see a driver. The figure was too distant and indistinct to make out clearly, but it appeared to be wearing a trucker's cap, and seemed to be staring directly at Dakota's mirrors, as if aware that it was being observed. The driver never moved, never shifted position, just maintained that constant unwavering gaze. Hour after hour. By the time Dakota reached Denver, he was approaching full panic. The thing in his mirrors had been following him for over 12 hours through multiple states and fuel stops, never deviating from its position and never disappearing except when he left the interstate. Other drivers were clearly disturbed by his presence, giving his truck a wide berth and flashing their lights in warning patterns he did not understand. Dakota pulled into a truck stop on the outskirts of Denver and sought out other drivers, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening to him. But when he approached other truckers in the parking lot or the restaurant, they would look at him with expressions of fear and disgust before quickly walking away. One older driver actually crossed himself and muttered what sounded like a prayer in Spanish before hurrying back to his truck. In the truck stop bathroom, Dakota caught sight of himself in the mirror and gasped in horror. Staring back at him was not his own reflection, but the face of the driver from the phantom truck, gaunt and pale with eyes like black holes and a mouth twisted into an expression of eternal hunger. When Dakota raised his hand to touch his face, the reflection did the same, but the movement was wrong, delayed by a fraction of a second, as if the mirror image had to think about what it was supposed to do. Dakota stumbled backward from the mirror, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he looked again, his own reflection was back, but there was something different about it. His eyes seemed darker, his skin paler, and when he smiled tentatively, his teeth appeared sharper than they should be. Outside in the parking lot, Dakota noticed that other truckers were loading their rigs and leaving the truck stop with obvious haste, as if his very presence was contaminating the area. A security guard approached him and politely but firmly asked him to move on, explaining that other customers were complaining about his truck. "What exactly are they complaining about?" Dakota asked. The guard looked uncomfortable. "They say there is something following you, sir. Something that makes them nervous. I cannot see it myself, but several drivers have reported seeing strange lights behind your rig, even when you're parked." Dakota climbed back into his cab and checked his mirrors. Sure enough, even though his truck was stationary in the parking lot, The phantom headlights were still there, maintaining their impossible position behind him. The other truck appeared to be parked as well, its driver still staring through the windshield with that unblinking gaze. As Dakota pulled back onto Interstate 80, heading west toward Salt Lake City, he realized that whatever was following him was not just pursuing his truck. It was changing him, transforming him into something like itself. The reflection in the truck stop bathroom had shown him his future, a pale, hungry thing trapped forever behind the wheel of a phantom truck, following other drivers through their mirrors and spreading the same curse that now afflicted him. Over the next few hours, Dakota began to understand the true horror of his situation. He was becoming the thing he had been running from, and somewhere behind another unsuspecting trucker, his own truck was probably appearing in their mirrors as an unexplainable set of headlights that maintained perfect following distance, regardless of speed or route changes. The curse was spreading, passed from driver to driver, like a supernatural virus. Each infected trucker became another phantom on the highways, visible only in mirrors, forever pursuing other drivers and slowly transforming them into copies of themselves. Dakota could feel the change accelerating now, his humanity slipping away mile by mile as his reflection became more distorted and alien. By the time he reached the Utah border, Dakota could barely remember his life before the road. His memories of family, friends, and home were fading like radio signals from a distant station. All that remained was the endless highway, the hypnotic rhythm of the road, and the compulsion to follow other drivers through their mirrors, until they too became part of the phantom convoy that now stretched across the American highway system. The thing that had once been Dakota Jensen continued west, its headlights reflecting in the mirrors of an unsuspecting flatbed driver, hauling steel toward California. And behind that driver, another set of phantom lights would soon appear. They are the truckers who pushed too hard, drove too long, and lost themselves somewhere in the space between the road and the reflection. And in truck stops across the country, drivers whisper warnings about checking your mirrors too often, because sometimes what looks back at you is not your own reflection, the face of something that has been following you far longer than you realize. Vincent Castellano had been craving a real meal for the past 200 minutes when he finally spotted the neon sign cutting through the Kentucky darkness like a beacon of salvation. Millie's 24-hour diner proclaimed the vintage sign in cheerful pink and blue letters with an arrow pointing toward a building that sat back from Interstate 75 like something preserved from the 1950s. Vinny, as he was known to his CB buddies, was a second-generation trucker from Newark, New Jersey, with thick forearms covered in faded tattoos, and a gut that testified to too many years of truck stop food and irregular eating schedules. At 43, he had been driving long haul for over 20 years, following routes his father had run before him. But in all those years of crisscrossing the country, he had never seen this particular diner before. It was 2:47 a.m., according to his dashboard clock, when Vinny pulled his Kenworth into the gravel parking lot beside the diner. Building looked like a classic American roadside establishment, complete with chrome fixtures, large windows, and that distinctive streamlined architecture that spoke of an era when the future looked bright and optimistic. Warm yellow light spilled from the windows, promising hot coffee and comfort food to weary travelers. The parking lot was surprisingly full for such a late hour. A dozen cars were scattered across the gravel along with two other 18-wheelers parked at the far end, near a stand of pine trees. The vehicles looked older than Vinny expected. Classic American sedans and pickup trucks from the 1970s and 1980s, all maintained in pristine condition despite their age. Vinny was hauling auto parts from Detroit to Atlanta, a routine run he had made